Well, hello, CCDA. We are so grateful that you are joining us today for our second Locked in Solidarity webinar this year. So we are in the year of 2019. This is our sixth Locked in Solidarity season here at CCDA, and it is a week of action and awareness around mass incarceration. Here at CCDA, we have many justice issues that we care about, that we know our communities are impacted by, but we have chosen 3 advocacy platform issues that we really want to intentionally engage. And mass incarceration is one of them, as well as immigration reform and education equity. Locked in Solidarity is a really special week for us because while we're working on reversing the impacts of mass incarceration throughout the year and trying to live out our mission as an association to inspire each other, to train each other, and to remain connected for the good kingdom transformation work we want to see in our communities. We really are grateful for the week and opportunity to really focus on mass incarceration and how we can reverse its devastating impacts. Today, I have 2 very good friends and partners of CCDA. Dominique Gilliard, who is no stranger to CCDA. He was a part of cohort 2 and the very first Locked in Solidarity and has remained engaged every single year. He's a CCDA board member. He chairs our Biblical Justice Committee and has spoken at our conference every year in some capacity. He is the author of a newly released book called Rethinking Incarceration, and we're just really grateful to have Dominique with us today. And then also, I'm just really excited to introduce to the CCDA community John Dacey. John Dacey founded an organization and is the executive director of Abolish private prisons. I've learned so much from John and his work, and I'm very excited to be able to introduce him to you and to really learn just a lot of the things that he knows about private prisons, and also how he really wants to utilize his organization and partners to reverse the private prison industry. So thank you again for joining us. And I'm going to go ahead and start by turning it over to John for him to share his element. John, thank you for joining with us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Michelle, thank you very much to CCDA and to you for this opportunity to address your community. I created an Arizona nonprofit organization, Abolish Private Prisons, in 2015 to deal with issues related to criminal justice reform. And we picked the name Abolish Private Prisons quite deliberately. We wanted there to be no ambiguity as to what we're about. We use the verb abolish to hearken back to the pre-Civil War abolition movement. We do view incarceration for profit as a modern form of slavery and an abdication by government of its proper role. So our first priority at Abolish Private Prisons is to file lawsuits in federal courts to challenge the very constitutionality of incarceration for profit. By that, I mean we intend to challenge those state and federal laws that authorize contracting with private vendors to take away people's liberty and to punish. And we intend to challenge the contracts that various governments enter into with these private entities in order to implement private incarceration. If you think of Brown versus Board of Education as a model for the kind of litigation we have in mind, Brown occurred at a time when our laws and our culture required segregation of our public schools, and it took quite an effort to get before the United States Supreme Court to change the law. In that instance, Thurgood Marshall and his colleagues were having to overcome existing Supreme Court precedent that authorized Jim Crow laws and segregation. We're not facing that kind of an obstacle here. What we intend to do is file potentially in multiple federal jurisdictions in order to get the case in front of the Supreme Court faster. In general, I would start with this question. Pitting individual liberty directly against huge corporate profits, what could possibly go wrong? Well, we'll talk about that in just a moment in the slides. But what we intend to do is challenge the per se existence of private prisons. So what we're not doing, to be quite clear, is saying public prisons do the job so much better than the privates. That's a slippery slope. It always depends on the comparison on what day regarding what facilities, and that's not what we're about. We don't believe the private prison industry should exist at all. So to talk about private prisons for a moment, what we are talking about are the circumstances where government turns over total operational control of a private prison, of a prison to a private vendor, delegating to them the authority to punish under our laws, to incarcerate, to use force, including deadly force, to write incident reports that affect things like early release time credits and eligibility for parole. And in our view, make no mistake, the number one loyalty of the private prison corporation management will always be to its shareholders, not to the public. In our view, once the majority of the states and 4 federal agencies and various local governments have paid large amounts of money to several corporations to implement the incarceration function, government has also created a very powerful industry that, like any for-profit industry, wants to grow and sustain its existence. So let's, if we could talk about a couple of the slides for a moment. The first slide on the board displays how far off the rails the United States has come over the last 30 to 40 years. Since 1980, we have seen a 450% increase in our rate of incarceration. Our population didn't increase anything like that. And the graph on the left shows that. We went from about 500,000 people in our prisons and jails in 1980 to about 2.3 million today. The graph on the right indicates, in addition to the people actually incarcerated, we have 2.5 times that people that are on probation and parole. The next slide shows that justice has not been colorblind. So what I find astonishing is a Black male born in the United States, 2000 or later, has a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison, compared to 1 in 17 for Anglo males. And the graph shows some other groups with this kind of racial disparity, with Latinos as well, the fastest growing cohort being African American women. The next slides, the next 3 slides, give some example of, gee, what could possibly go wrong if we make it profitable to huge corporations in order to put people in prisons and jails and immigration detention centers, which, by the way, are run by these same private prison companies predominantly. So the first slide here, the Kids for Cash scandal out of Pennsylvania, is an example of corruption, which of course can occur in any circumstance. But here we had a judge sending hundreds and hundreds of Black teenagers into detention in exchange for kickbacks from the private vendor. In the next slide, we see an illustration here, or a highlighting of how once we spend so much money, several $billions a year on these private vendors, it creates a powerful lobby. And a lobby that opposes criminal justice reform, alternatives to incarceration, decriminalization, and the like. And in the next slide, here we have an example of a federal judge, according to this article, whose spouse purchased private prison stock just before an immigration raid. Well, I don't know whether that's illegal or not, but it certainly looks unethical and immoral for our system to create these kinds of incentives. So go to the next slide, please. Actually back up if you would, if it's possible. But what I want to talk about is, what is the connection here to mass incarceration? If only 8 to 9% of all prisoners are in private facilities as opposed to public, why focus on private prisons? And the answers are these. Number one, because you have to start somewhere. And a small group of people can have a huge impact on a very big issue if we're successful in front of the Supreme Court. The second thing is, if you have an early diagnosis of cancer, you don't wait until it metastasizes before you address it. And perverse profit incentives in the criminal justice system are cancers, and they are spreading. This industry is growing in the United States. Globally, it is diversifying into for-profit probation, parole, and other kinds of services. So it's time to do something about it before this industry becomes too big to fail. And what I mean by that is, before government becomes so dependent on the private facilities that it becomes politically unpalatable for some judges, perhaps, to apply the law as perhaps they should. So we intend to focus on other criminal justice issues, but job one is to file lawsuits in federal court to challenge constitutionality. And the reason is this simple. I don't mean to pick on any administration, but at the end of the Obama administration, they announced through the Department of Justice they would no longer use private prisons, and private prison stocks tumbled. The next election resulted in a reversal of that announcement, and private prison stocks have shot up. Well, what's behind the stock? It's human beings in cells. But what this dynamic illustrates is how temporary political results can be, which is why we want a decision under the United States Constitution.
John, thank you so much for your presentation. I know that we're going to be asking questions. How can we help? How can we engage more deeply? And we'll have time for that a little bit later in our program, but you definitely have given us things, to think about. I think often when we at CCDA, we think about relationships and nonprofits, and then we start to move into places like legislation. And we learned yesterday about how important it is to build relationships with prosecutors and help with sentencing. And just, this is a great illustration of just the diversity that we need to have when we approach something like mass incarceration, and to really question the constitutionality, and are just grateful for partners like you and others that bring their skills to the table as lawyers and also in other roles to help really take on these systems one bite at a time. So at this point, I'm going to introduce Dominique. And Dominique, thank you so much for joining us. And I know you have a lot to say about private prisons, and of course, as a pastor and a theologian, also have reflections for the church. So please, thank you for coming, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. When we think about private prisons, they don't really emerge on the scene until 1984 in Tennessee. We see the first one, and the reality is that private prisons only exist because we literally ran out of space within our state and federal facilities to incarcerate people. And so we have to acknowledge the fact that we live in a nation that is addicted to incarceration. And because of this addiction, we have outpaced the number of state and federal facilities to house people for offenses. And when we think about private prisons, they literally are for-profit industries. And so the purpose of their existence is to reap profit. And we see historically that the roots of private prisons find their antecedents really in an exploitative system of convict leasing that emerges right after the triangular slave trade is abolished in our nation. So as we have more of a background for this conversation, as Christians, it should lead us into a deeper theological reflection on what does it mean for us to participate in a criminal justice system or to condone through our silence a criminal justice system that is really rooted in the love of money. And so we see this most explicitly called out in 1 Timothy 6:9 through 10. It says, "Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." And we see this with the privatization of our criminal justice system and how many believers are actually complicit with the growth and the expansion of private prisons, from anything from investing in Wall Street stocks and bonds within private prisons to how many of our, unwittingly, how many of our own investment dollars are rooted in companies that are investing in private prisons, our banking institutions that are ultimately leveraging capital for private prisons to expand. And so I think it calls us to a new consideration of how we steward our resources and if our resources are actually being deployed in a way that leverage the criminal justice system or empower the private prison system to continue to grow and expand in a way that really is antithetical to the restoring, reconciling work that God is up to in the world and that God has invited us to partner with God with. But that one of the things about our engagement with Scripture is that there's multiple places in which the Word is calling us to see the way in which the love of money or the way in which some of the profiteering that comes from unjust policies is something the Scripture is calling us to have an eye for. And so in Proverbs, we also see that we are called to, in chapter 31, verses 5 and then 8 through 9, it says, this is the mother of the king who is talking to him and giving him a warning. And she says that you are not supposed to rule like other judges do, but you are supposed to rule with fairness, with your faith at the forefront of what does it mean to judicially represent the nation. And she says that ultimately that this means that the king must speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute, speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. And right now we have a criminal justice system, particularly when we look at private prisons, that are preying on the poor and the needy. We are seeing the exploitation probably most explicitly crystallized through some of the cases that we're seeing that come through people who are being arrested by ICE and detained and who are being forced to confront the criminal justice system in a way that is not defending the poor and the needy. We have so many people who are seeking asylum who are coming here to preserve their life or the lives of their family. And in some cases, they're coming here to make a better life because there are extending policies that have made it virtually impossible for them to sustain a life where they currently reside. And in these cases, we've seen how many young children as young as 3 years old, who have been forced to go before a court of law and represent themselves. And we see that this is just something, again, the Scripture calls us to kind of be aware of, but also calls us to actually realize that it's not in accordance and congruence with our faith. In Deuteronomy 1:16 through 18, we see that it says, "And I charged your judges at the time, hear the disputes between your people and judge fairly, whether the case is between two Israelites or between an Israelite and a foreign residing among you. Do not show partiality in judging. Hear both small and great alike. Do not be afraid of anyone, for judgment belongs to God. Bring me any case that is too hard for you, and I will hear it. And at that time, I told you everything you were to do. And we see that in these cases, we have little kids who literally many times don't even speak English, much less have any comprehension of the complexity of the law that they're being asked to represent themselves. And so we have a criminal justice system that is directly connected to private prisons, because 73% of people who are detained for immigration offenses are housed within private prisons. And private prisons have become this big business, to the point that we know the two largest private prisons in our nation in 2011 collectively made $3.3 billion. And this has become a huge lucrative industry that is really predicated upon preying upon the least of these, the poor and immigrants who are trying to come to this country oftentimes for asylum. And then the last place where I really see scripture calling us to be aware of the way in which our criminal justice system is rooted in the love of money and rooted in grotesque profiteering that is not part of the kingdom economy, but is more aligned with a capitalistic approach to always looking for the maximum profits, even when the maximum profits is rooted in exploitation of the poor and the least of these. And as CCDA practitioners, we know that we are commissioned to be people who walk alongside of and defend the rights of the poor and the needy, and people who are going to speak to unjust systems and structures. We see in Acts 16, verses 16 through 40, Paul and Silas are ultimately incarcerated because they liberate a demon-possessed slave woman who is getting exploited by her slave owners because she's able to predict the future. And when they cast out the demon from her, the text tells us that they are arrested because they ultimately put all the slave owners' ability to profit off of her exploitation in jeopardy. And in doing so, it says it threw the whole city into a chaos, which is interesting. It didn't say it threw these two men's financial profiteering into chaos. It said the whole city was thrown into chaos because the whole city was ultimately implicated in this systemic oppression and marginalization of the least of these. And when they are actually taken to court, the court is in the marketplace. And this is scripture surely but surely trying to tell us that the judges and the magistrates were ultimately more devoted to their love of money than their commitment to justice. And so these slave owners knew that, and they took the Paul and Silas to court and trial in front of the city in the marketplace. And ultimately the judges continue and the magistrates make judicial decisions that are going to continue the profiteering of the city upon the oppressed and the marginalized, as opposed to a judgment that's going to actually bring justice and fairness and righteousness into the city as the norms. And so we have to see the ways in which that story is a foreshadowing of this context that we find ourselves in today in the US, where we have a criminal justice system where we lock up more people than any country in the history of the world. And we presently have more prisons, jails, and detention centers in our nation than we do degree granting institutions. The love of money is really what we're seeing play out in our criminal justice system. And it's really a byproduct of the church's unwillingness to stand up and boldly bear witness to the inbreaking nature of the kingdom of God in the way that we see Paul and Silas do in this text, that really calls out the collaborating structures and institutions that are also profiteering off of a corrupt criminal justice system that is, again, more devoted to the love of money than justice and righteousness.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dominique, for sharing. I know there's a lot there, and I know, John, you have a lot as well to really offer. And what I would like to do is we kind of take off our mute from our microphones, and the three of us just have a conversation about drilling deeper a little bit more into some of the legislative and procedural insights on private prisons. You know, you had just a really brief overview to kind of help us understand what private prison the private prison industry is, a little bit about just reminding us that we need to weigh in this, not just as Americans, and certainly if not from party lines, but really as Christians. And what are we as Christians going to do about some of the things that we're learning about? So I think, often we talk about systemic injustice. And this is obviously an issue of systemic injustice, rooted in racism. And, we're not going to take a lot of time to talk about that history, about that right now. But when you look at trying to impact issues of systemic injustice, there are, like I said, there's certain foundations, there's certain systems that you kind of want to go. I know, John, around the court system, that was definitely a new way of thinking. Probably because I'm not a lawyer and I hang around with a lot of amazing pastors and nonprofit leaders in the faith community. We don't think, oh yeah, that's right, we're going to sue the federal government on the constitutionality. But I would love to just drill down a little bit on that. And then any insights that you or Dominique have just about the way the system is. Who has the power to make the change? Usually in advocacy, that's what we need to know. If we're going to lift up our voice and either speak on behalf of someone else, and that immigration detention is a really good example of that, or we're going to join alongside people directly impacted by mass incarceration and, join alongside their voice with that. What are some of the systems that are at play here? Who are the people that we need to be speaking to?
So, you could tell from my earlier remarks, I'm talking about addressing federal judges. But my reason for being on this particular program and speaking in front of a number of other faith audiences is because we're trying to build momentum in support of even a legal cause. So if I could back up just a little bit, this is about our future. This is about what kind of country we're going to be, what our government will do, and what the government will turn over to the marketplace. What kind of people are we going to be going forward? So to be quite clear, we're not opposed to government turning over many functions to the private sector, building a road, managing a hospital. But when it comes to taking away people's liberty, a core function of government, in our view, that crosses a line. That is the government's responsibility alone. And once the government turns over incarceration to the marketplace, it changes the status of the jailer, and the jailer matters a great deal. So in this circumstance, it's true the jailer doesn't put the person in jail or prison, but what happens inside the walls has a lot to do with when the person gets out and whether they successfully re-enter society. And this is aside from the lobbying efforts. And when you have a jailer that's paid a per diem, like a hotel, so the hotel doesn't get paid when their room is empty. They get paid when the room is full. And the prison model is the same. It has an incentive to keep the beds full, the cells full, and to have a lot more cells with a lot more people in them. This is a perverse incentive, and it is an abdication by government of its proper role. It also, in my view, comes back to the issue of human dignity. So if you look at this system from the standpoint of the individual who's in this system, that person becomes human inventory on corporate balance sheets. Each individual in a private prison cell represents a unit of profit to the prison corporation by the person's very presence in the cell. I'm not even talking about leasing their labor at this point. So the human person becomes a commodity. And if we go back to the spirit of our laws in this country, the Declaration of Independence is not one of our laws, but it embodies the spirit of our laws. And it talks a lot about human dignity, referring to divine providence or our creator or nature's God 4 times in referring to each person having certain inalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, we are now trading those core values in the marketplace and on the New York Stock Exchange. And if you think about what happens when Hawaii or Vermont send people to prisons in Arizona, what's happening is we're taking people in shackles, more often than not, people of color, from their homes, far from anyone who would ever visit them, so that a corporation can make a profit. And the corporation got the contract through a public auction to serve a certain number of bodies, to have a certain number of human beings in their complete control. Well, what the heck does that look like?
Yeah. Wow.
Well, it looks like what it is, and the fact that I think we have to really reckon with the fact that slavery in our nation has never truly been abolished because of the loophole that exists within the 13th Amendment, which says the slavery in our nation is unconstitutional except as a punishment for a crime. And so we need to forthrightly name the fact that we live in a nation in 2019 that still permits slavery. And we have millions of brothers and sisters who are enslaved, and they are treated in ways that deface the image of God that is inherent within them, and they're exploited for their labor. And we have congressional directives that actually have made this possible. So you talked about not wanting to bash parties. And I think one of the ways that we have to have this conversation is looking at the fact that both the Republican and Democratic Party are implicated in this. So much so that we know in 2010, a Democrat by the name of Robert Byrd introduced a congregational directive that said ICE on average must maintain 34,000 people nightly for immigration offenses, and those people who are detained are disproportionately housed within private prisons. We see that there's a direct correlation between the growth and prosperity of private prisons and punitive legislation that has been unrolled with the war on immigration, is what I like to call it, because when you actually look at the parallels between earmark funding and special task force that have been deployed to actually wage this war on the border, and then within our communities and cities and neighborhoods, we see that there's a direct parallel between the same earmark funding and special task force that were rolled out with the war on drugs. And so what it looks like is exactly what it is, and I appreciate you calling that out. This is the continuation of this dark, sinister, and ungodly legacy of slavery that our nation has been addicted to profiteering off of, and it has been built upon the backs of people of color, particularly Black and brown people, with this conversation. But I think the other thing that we need to call out and acknowledge is one of the ways that private prisons continue to reap their benefits is that the vast majority of private prisons, well, not the vast majority, private prisons, period, don't actually have to be legislative incorporated as what they are, incarceration facilities, but they are instead able to be classified as real estate investment trusts, which allows them to escape a lot of the taxation that should be actually applied to them as facilities, and they're able to profiteer and pocket that money. The other thing is private prisons are able to legitimate themselves by saying that there are cheaper, more cost-effective ways of incarcerating people than we see on the state and the federal level. But the reason why they're cheaper is because they cut so many corners. And we've seen study after study that have proven that private prisons are actually more unsafe for people who are incarcerated and for guards who are working within the facility. And there have also been a number of lawsuits that have come up against corporations like Aramark, who provide services to food within private prisons where there have been maggots found in the food. And so we need to hold these private prison companies accountable when they make these proclamations that the reason why they are expanding and we're becoming more dependent upon them is because they're more fiscally responsible. But they're also unethical in the way that they're cutting corners and making people who are incarcerated and people who are working within the facilities more unsafe.
Yeah. One of the things I do want to dig deep into a little bit is on the prison labor piece, because it does feel like there's this loophole. I know in Colorado, we've spent the last few years trying to reverse, our state constitution, which has that provision and it allows, people to work for unfair wages. And so I don't know who wants to take this one, but would love to just, first of all, not very many people know about this, right? And so I would love to hear exactly, what elements, what is prison labor, and then how does it tie to that constitutionality? And we've seen trickle down in states. So we'll start there, and then I know I want to go with more questions, but whoever would like to, John and Dominique, both of you can weigh in. I would love that.
I'll jump in. Dominique, please, whenever. There's one thing I want to go back to, and that is the issue of the 13th Amendment and the appearance of it permitting slavery when it is the result of a criminal conviction and is punishment for a crime. There are several Supreme Court justices in the past in concurring or dissenting opinions that have said they believe that the prohibition of slavery is absolute and that the punishment clause exception in the 13th Amendment applies to indentured servitude, not slavery. And that is one of the arguments we are going to advance when we file, which is slavery is never appropriate. And in that regard, the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, in our view, is a barometer of evolving standards of decency. Not in our view. That's how the court has interpreted it. And I just cannot see a court today saying slavery is okay in the modern world under any circumstance. So first of all, I want to mention that. But then to the issue of slavery, one of the reasons we want to go to the courthouse is because some aspects of the judicial system, our criminal justice system, have been complicit in our past in re-enslaving the freed slaves after the Civil War through the criminal justice system. And so, as in Dominique's book and in others, there's a description of the convict leasing system that resulted from that, with the huge impact in particular on African American men. There's a wonderful book called Worse Than Slavery, wonderful in the sense that it is a very, very compelling description of just how horribly we have treated people through our criminal justice system to keep slavery going despite the Civil War. I'm familiar with the Colorado case. I think there's a similar case going on in Georgia. But from our standpoint, the existence of the private prison industry itself and the profiting from the mere presence of people in those facilities is the 13th Amendment violation.
And when we talk about the exploitation of prison labor in particular, we need to understand that people behind bars are doing everything from making airplane parts for Boeing to being taken out to fight wildfires in California, and they are having a day taken off of their sentence per day that they go and actually fight these wildfires. But to actually pay a trained professional to fight the wildfires, it will cost around $26 an hour. The average person who is behind bars is making anything from 93 cents to $4 a day for a full day's worth of labor. And so when you allow companies and corporations to come and produce items behind bars, then they're able to pocket all of that money that is being profiteered off of the backs of incarcerated brothers and sisters. And so they're doing everything from making lingerie products for Victoria's Secret to furniture that is is on our college dormitories. I actually just had a call with sojourners last week where they were talking about the ethical dilemma that's going on with churches, where churches are now wondering if they can buy pews and sanctuary equipment that is being made with prison labor because it's so much cheaper. And I had to remind them in the interview that within the kingdom economy, the bottom line question is not always about profitability. It's about, are we properly and ethically stewarding our resources in a way that bear witness to the inbreaking nature of the kingdom of God? And for sometimes for Christians, we have to acknowledge that means that we're going to miss out on some certain profits, certain unholy dividends that are actually rooted in the love of money and the dehumanization of our brothers and sisters. And that's what's going on with so many people behind bars. They're doing everything from agricultural work to turpentine work. They've historically worked in coal mills and mining and harvesting. And so across the board, and their everyday household products, they're connected to Costco and all of these different huge industries that we all have in our household. And so we have to really start to do some of the work. And within the resource that we'll talk about later, I have a whole list of companies that use actual prison labor for the production of their items that we buy and house within our homes.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, Michelle. I was going to say the Netflix documentary, 13th, also has a good description in the final third of the film about the various corporate interests that profit greatly from public and private incarceration. There's one thing I'd want to mention in terms of how we at Abolish Private Prisons are looking at this issue. The common thread in all of this is the activity of government. So the private prison corporations, if you look at it strictly as a marketplace dynamic, exist and are responding to what government says is a need. And so it is our elected officials that have passed the laws that authorize, if not require, government use of private prisons and jails and private detention centers. And it is the elected officials that are accepting the lobbying money, the donations and the like, to sustain the private prison industry and help it grow. So it is government that is responsible for this, which provides the direct connection to all of your viewers in terms of how people can do something.
And Michelle, I just want to add one more thing. One other rationale that legitimates prison labor is that people say, well, they're behind bars, they need to pay their debt to society. Isn't it good that they work? They learn a work ethic and they get back into the routine. So when they come out, they have marketable skills. My problem with that argument is that it falls down when a person is incarcerated for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and they've been working for a corporation, becoming experts in their craft, and then they're released from prison, and they go back to that same corporation and apply for that same job that they've done for 20, 30 years, and they're denied access to the job because of their criminal record. That bluntly says that your labor is only desirable when it's exploitable. And so we actually need to advocate for provisions that say for companies who are actually producing commerce behind bars, they have to have an allotment of jobs that are available for returning citizens who are coming out.
Dominique,
so, yeah.
I've never heard that before. Is that actually a movement, or are we starting it? Because I think that is spot on.
That is an argument. I think we're starting it, and I have a whole list within the resource we'll talk about later where I make that argument, because we need to increase taxes on commerce that's produced behind bars, and we need to hold these entities that are profiteering to have an allotted number of jobs that are available for returning citizens.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's really good. I always learn so much, so I appreciate that. You know, this past August, we put together our August Recess Toolkit. We were trying to support, we were trying to do meetings with Congress around the country, and the First Step Act was a part of it. But in that back of that resource had all of the different congressional leaders who had accepted money from the private prison industry. I think we need to know who is benefiting from this. And I think it's helpful to know the elected officials. I think it's helpful to know, the private companies and really hold people accountable. So, so that definitely is a resource people can look at. I think just on a personal level, this is obviously very true for immigrant detention centers too. And, what's sort of unique about immigrant detention centers is you are often detained, especially right now with the asylum crisis, that you're detained just for asking for help. Until your hearing is able to, you're credible for your hearing is able to be heard, you are sitting in, prisons, correctional facilities as a prisoner, and you are having some of this exploitation of labor. And so I was at a detention center this summer with people who had been, just asking for asylum. And of course, were in their jumpsuits and in shackles. It's just crazy. They hadn't done anything except presented themselves at the border, and that could take a whole other webinar just of those injustices. But they were the guards were sharing just how people spent their time, and that if they worked for the day, they got $1. And they were explaining how immigrants were really, really grateful for the opportunity to do things. And, they were listing all of the things. Basically, immigrants were cleaning the facility, they were taking care of it. And so that's some of the cutting back private prisons. The industry is able to make more because they don't have to cover their own cleaning. They don't have to cover some of their own construction, and you make $1 a day. And so I was in one of the rooms, and, it was just a place with multiple beds, in one of the cells, and they had a soda machine. And if you went over to the soda machine and you clicked it to buy a soda, it was $1.25. And so after an entire day's work and a little bit more, you might be able to afford a soda. And so even just what you had shared about people, that kind of paying their time. I agree with your arguments, but these are people who have not committed any crimes. It's not illegal or against, against our laws to present yourself as an asylum seeker, yet you are a part of the private prison industry. You are a part of helping shore it up with your labor. And if you want something in return with your money, you can pay $1.25 for a soda. I could go on with a lot of different stories of just what we do with people's money, when they seek asylum, and how we hold it and don't give it back. But that's not for this particular webinar. Now we've got probably about 10 more minutes on what can we do. This, I think, John, you have talked to me about different people that trying to build cases. This would be a great opportunity to tell us at CCDA the kind of people that you are hoping might want to step into this, as far as cases to kind of walk through with federal judges. And Dominique, I do want you to share not your 20 points, but your 20-point advocacy resource that goes along with your book, because I think these are very practical ways that we can lean in and really have some imagination that maybe we can be a part of reversing this part of mass incarceration. So yeah, gentlemen, thank you.
Perhaps if we could go to my final slide, if it's possible.
Sure. Anna, hopefully you can pull that up for us.
Yeah, there are some examples. So obviously what we need is lawyering, and it's going to take more than one or two people. Right now, our organization, we have a staff attorney, we have me. I've left my private practice to do this. And we've been meeting with large law firms and university people around the country, and speaking with a number of faith and secular groups. So number one, any group, organization can pass a resolution calling for abolition of for-profit incarceration and immigration detention. If you go to our website, abolishprivateprisons.org, you'll see that there are a number of resolutions there from faith groups, secular groups, and the like. A number of churches that have passed resolutions calling for abolition on, among other grounds, gospel grounds as well. Divestment is another strategy. There are a number of pension funds that are invested in these publicly traded corporations. So there are three major prison corporations that control the market, two of which are traded on the New York Stock Exchange, CoreCivic and Geo Group. And students at the University of Columbia, for example, in 2015, convinced the trustees of the university to divest their pension funds. Students in the California university system have also been successful. You can see headlines from around the country for teachers' pensions, for example, that are now looking at pulling their investments from these organizations. Networking is part of it.
So John, before you go on, let me just hone in on that, because we've been talking about how private businesses and corporations are benefiting, but really where you're sharing with the division that we as individuals, our retirement funds, may be tied to the profit of these private prison industries, and that we are in many ways, with whether it's fault of our own, could be a part of this and benefit from private prisons personally as a result of where our investments are.
That's right. And usually it's because of an investment through a larger mutual fund or something like that. But if I'm old enough to remember the effort to divest from South Africa during the time of apartheid, when some of the investment strategies were to do just that, create investment opportunities that did not include South Africa until apartheid was ended. So there are things to do along that line as well. Research and writing is always going to be a need. And that can include not just legal research and writing, but historical. So for example, exactly what were the discussions in the Congress and elsewhere at the time the 13th Amendment was passed? As an example, donations, of course. So when we go to the Supreme Court, we want to go there showing broad-based support across the political, faith-based, and secular aisles. And so amicus briefing from different organizations will also be very helpful.
That's great. Thank you. I've often wanted Locked in Solidarity to grow to that all of us in our state capitals would really be pushing for resolutions, and this may just be a good thing. I mean, maybe we'll learn this year and maybe we can join you in that piece as far as resolutions regarding private prisons. So Dominique, you go ahead and share a little bit. I know we're getting ready to close out, but want to hear from you and just some of your thoughts on how we can engage.
Yeah, kind of continuing on what John was just saying, the teachers union just put out a whole document early 2 months ago calling for the divestment of retirement funds for all teachers from entities that are invested in private prisons. We also see that the Episcopal Church in 2015 did the same thing. And there's a church there in New York, the Church of Wall Street, that is actively raising this issue as a ecclesial issue that the body of Christ needs to be concerned about, because we are complicit when we are reaping benefits, whether knowingly or unknowingly. As the light gets shined on it, we start to have to make ethical responses to the new information that is coming towards us. And then the other thing is, we saw this with the last election. There is a whole group of people, rural people who are impoverished, who are feeling overlooked, who are feeling neglected, who are feeling like they are not a part of justice conversations or conversations about the economy. And when we look at private prisons and where private prisons are housed, they're disproportionately housed in these impoverished, neglected rural communities, where oftentimes the injustice that is going on there is out of sight and out of mind. And oftentimes they come in and they have these contracts, and these contracts essentially say that private prisons will be here for up to 10 years. And in doing so, a lot of times we're seeing people who are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Does my family go without, or do I take a job at this private prison? Because this is the only investment, the only industry, the only jobs that are available. So what I think we need to be doing is, how do we creatively think about new economic solutions for these communities in these rural contexts that are deprived of economic opportunities and investment, and say that this is not the only way. There are other ways that are rooted in a kind of righteous civic engagement and ethic that can produce work that isn't rooted in the exploitation of other people. And so I think, as people are doing the work of community development, I think sometimes we can get so boxed within our own context, that we lack the imagination that might not be possible in other communities. But if we are able to, if we want to take private prisons away, we also have to think creatively about what are we going to offer up for these communities economically so they can actually put food on their table. So that's one of the things that I think is the next step for us as an association, to think about, like, how can we start to do these kind of creative startup economic ventures in rural contexts to help replace some of the job first that the private prison industry provides.
That's the whole role of Christian community development, right? And we always need to be thinking more in rural. I know that's a stretching point for us at CCDA. I know there are people that are in rural settings, but we definitely need to do a better job of lifting that up for sure, but also exploring more ways that we can help do community development that is just, you know, in those rural communities.
Because it's directly connected to prison gerrymandering, which is something that we don't talk about a lot. And within the resource, I've referenced it a couple of times. I think there might be a slide, but you can access it at walkingtowardslove.com. Yeah, walkingtowardslove.com. But there's this whole phenomenon of prison gerrymandering where people who are being taken from the urban core and the urban center are being incarcerated, and they're being incarcerated in these rural facilities. And when the U.S. Census comes, they're being counted where they're housed as opposed to where they geographically resided at the time of the offense. And that's skewing political influence, governmental investment in communities that otherwise would be and should be receiving that investment. And so this becomes a huge systemic political, social implications, social, political, and economic implications for what we're talking about.
Sure, absolutely. Well, just to let everybody know, I've put up on the webinar page, of course, if many of you may be watching this as a recording, so it's going to be a recording as well as live right now. But on the page, right by the bios of John and Dom, we have links to Abolish Private Prisons, so you can look a little bit more into that organization. And then Walking Towards Love. Walking Towards Love. And there's tell us a little bit. It's got a video curriculum. Tell us a little bit about what we're going to get when we click that.
Yeah, so Walking Towards Love is a brand new video-based small group curriculum that's completely free. All you have to do is put your email in to download it. There's a video base to it, then there's a written piece, and then in addition to that, afterwards, you can download a 20-point platform for advocacy and reform for our criminal justice system.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the 20-point advocacy reform document. I've obviously read it. I think the best thing about the video of Walking Towards Love is Dominique does a lot of walking in it while he's talking. So it's both literal as well as figuratively. And yeah, we're just looking forward to opportunities to really deeply engage. I think over the last, 5+ years, as we have been learning as an association what the phenomena of mass incarceration is in the articulation and really thinking about it a little bit more on that systemic side, I think we understood the ramifications of it. We've seen it for decades in our community. And so I'm just excited, and actually I'm just proud of our association in general for how we continue to lean in every year. And I feel like we've got some really great resources in the two of you, as well as in the things that you're offering, as well as just the bigger association. So just thank you. Thank you so much for providing us with this time with you and for giving us the opportunity to do a webinar together. And we look forward to continuing to work together to reverse the impacts of mass incarceration, and most specifically, how we can lean into abolishing private prisons. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for our time together.
Thank you.
Thank you.